Here's a brand that's been on the faces of motocross champions since before most of the sport's current fans were born. It survived the 80s marketing wars, the 90s style revolution, lost its most iconic employee to a rival, and somehow still came out the other side intact. That brand is Scott. Because motocross didn't just change on the tracks, the culture around it changed, what riders cared about changed, what fans bought changed, and the companies that survived had to change with it. Scott watched all that happen from the inside, and the choices they made reveal exactly what this sport became over the last 50 years. In 1970, motocross in America wasn't a lifestyle. The sport was still rough around the edges, built around local tracks, weekend racers, and riders funding everything themselves. Most riders treated the sport like a mechanical trade, not a performance art. They were mechanics first and racers second. And on a lot of weekends, the biggest problem wasn't speed, it was visibility. Goggles fogged constantly, cheap lenses shattered, riders were pulling eyewear down mid-race just to make it through a corner. Ed Scott was an engineer from Sun Valley, Idaho, who'd already made a name for himself by inventing the tapered aluminum ski pole, the kind that became standard across the ski industry. When he turned his attention to motocross, he wasn't chasing a market opportunity. He was solving a problem. Riders were going blind mid-race. The military surplus goggles and old leather aviator gear they were repurposing had no ventilation, fogged constantly, and sometimes shattered. Guys were pulling their goggles down to their chins and riding blind just to come around a turn they couldn't see through a fogged lens. Scott's goggle, introduced in 1970, addressed the problem directly. Lighter materials, better ventilation, foam that could actually manage sweat instead of trapping it against a rider's face. It wasn't flashy, it was functional. And in that era of motocross, functional was everything. The culture of that era mirrored the product perfectly. Riders traveled the country in beat-up vans stuffed with gas cans and spare parts. One of the people who came out of that era was a young mechanic named Robert Forti, better known as Bevo. At the time, he was just another kid grinding through the privateer circuit, doing whatever it took to keep bikes running and riders on the gate.
Bob, he lives in Sun Valley, Idaho, and that's where Scott was at the time. And Bill Larson called me over and says, "Hey, how'd you like to work for Scott?"
Years later, he'd become one of the most important figures in Scott's history. That world built Scott's reputation. Riders trusted the product because it worked. There was no other pitch needed. That innocence didn't last long. By the late 1970s, someone in the motocross industry had figured out something that would change everything. The goggle strap was advertising space. Positioned across the sides of a helmet, it was the most visible piece of real estate on a rider's body, especially in the close-up photography that filled every major motocross magazine. If you could put your logo there and make it bold enough, you were essentially buying a billboard on the most photographed part of the sport. Jim Jannard understood this before almost anyone else. In 1975, he started Oakley out of his garage in Southern California with $300 in his pocket, selling motorcycle grips out of the trunk of his car at local events. When he expanded into goggles in 1980 with the O-frame, the product had problems. The ventilation was poor enough that riders would fog out under race conditions and go temporarily blind, not entirely unlike the pre-Scott era everyone had been trying to leave behind. But Jannard made one decision that overrode every technical shortcoming. He put a massive Oakley logo directly on the goggle strap. Oakley wasn't really selling protection anymore. They were selling the feeling of being part of something cooler than the old motocross world. The man Oakley sent to execute this vision in the motocross paddock was a representative named Dane Duke, known universally as Duker. He wore a cowboy hat covered in the Oakley logo, goggle strap suspenders, tube socks, and shorts that were provocatively short by any standard, let alone the grease and grit standard of an early 80s motocross pit. He was impossible to ignore, which was entirely the point. In a paddock full of people who valued stoic competence, Duker was theater, and theater was new.
And then there's Duke on the starting line, right? I mean, we're 5 seconds from starting, and he's like polishing Johnny O'Mara's goggles, putting new goggles on him, new goggles on Ricky.
And I didn't have a pass.
The confrontation between these two brands came to a head at the 1982 NMA Pont with the top amateur riders, the young stars who would become the next generation of factory professionals. Duke had been physically chased out of competitor pits more than once, so he tried a different approach. He took a group of top mini-cycle racers, including Bruce Bunch, Rick Hem, and Kyle Fleming, out to a local Sonic Burger in downtown Ponca City, and over fast food, convinced them to abandon their Scott contracts and switch to Oakley. A fast food diner and a sales pitch probably shouldn't have mattered that much, but in a lot of ways, that was the moment the culture started changing. What happened after is one of the darkest moments in the sport's history. Shortly after that dinner, a car-train accident killed Bruce Bunch, Kyle Fleming, and Rick Hem, and left Dana Duke critically injured.
Well, to go from a train accident where it wasn't like he got out and had a few scratches. I mean, you flatlined on the helicopter, right? You flatlined. He was...
The corporate rivalry and the scorecard of who signed suddenly meant nothing. The paddock, for all its commercialization, was still a community of people, and it grieved like one. But the shift Duker had started didn't stop. The idea that riders could be swayed by brand personality, by swagger, by the feeling of being part of something cooler than the competition, that idea was now loose in the sport, and it would only grow. Scott's answer to Oakley's marketing aggression wasn't more marketing, it was engineering, and more specifically, it was logistics. Under the direction of product designer Scott Watanabe, the company released the 83 and 89 No Sweat goggle series, and they built them around a single idea: standardization. Every model in the lineup shared the same frame geometry. The same replacement lenses fit every goggle in the range. The same tear-offs worked across the entire system. That meant every motorcycle dealership in the country, from the major metro shops to the rural small-town operations, could stock a single set of parts and cover every Scott rider who walked through the door. For the average racer, this wasn't a minor convenience. It was the difference between finishing a race weekend and packing up early because your only lens got scratched on Friday and the nearest replacement was hours away. Scott built loyalty not through attitude, but through reliability at scale. While Oakley was winning the photo shoots and the personality wars, Scott was winning the parts counter at every dealership in the Midwest. There was also a human element that no marketing budget could manufacture. Bevo Forti had graduated from privateer mechanic to Scott's trackside rider support manager in 1981. And for the next 3 decades, he was the living embodiment of everything the brand stood for. Bevo was famous for his personality, his legendary appetite, and a t-shirt that read, "Who the hell is Bob Hanna?" that he wore in front of Bob Hanna with complete impunity. But what made him irreplaceable to Scott was his code. In an era when competing brands were beginning to treat riders as disposable assets, dropping them the moment results dropped or injury struck, Bevo treated his roster like family.
And at one time, I actually had racers like Damon and all those guys when the other companies came in. I had Stanton turn down $25,000 to stay with me. You know?
There's a story that captures this perfectly. At a Supercross event, a high-profile factory rider, frustrated with his goggle sponsor, slipped into Bevo's motorhome and asked to switch to Scott mid-season. For most brand managers, that would have been an easy yes. A factory name in Scott goggles was exactly the kind of endorsement that moved units. Bevo said no. He had a full roster of privateers and mid-pack riders already under his support budget, and he wasn't going to shortchange them to make room for someone chasing a better deal. He told the factory rider to come back when his contract was up. That story traveled through the paddock, and it mattered because it meant Scott wasn't playing the game the same as everyone else. Now, you might think Scott was safe at this point. Deep dealer relationships, strong amateur presence, a beloved trackside ambassador, and a technically superior product. But the 1990s brought a change so complete that none of that was enough to stay on top of the culture, and what happened next nearly broke the company. The person most responsible for that change was Jeremy McGrath. Before McGrath arrived, the model of a motocross champion was physical brutality. Riders like Bob Hanna and Jeff Stanton won through conditioning, aggression, and the ability to beat a motorcycle into submission for 40 minutes in the outdoor heat. McGrath came from BMX, and you could see it immediately. Most top riders of that era looked like they were fighting the motorcycle every lap. McGrath looked comfortable, relaxed even. He floated through sections that other riders were attacking. Then, he started throwing knack-knacks over the finish line jumps in the middle of his dominance, turning victory laps into just part of the show. Between 1993 and 2000, he won 72 Supercross main events and 7 Premier Class championships. The championships mattered, but what McGrath really changed was how motocross looked, felt, and carried itself. McGrath's dominance pulled the entire commercial center of gravity to the sport away from grueling outdoor nationals and into the stadium lights of indoor Supercross. And Supercross was television ready in a way that outdoor racing never quite was. Contained venues, loud crowds, visible jumps, and riders who looked like athletes rather than laborers. The sport became entertainment almost overnight, and once that happened, image started mattering as much as performance. Brands weren't just selling race equipment anymore. They were selling identity, attitude, and lifestyle. Fox Racing, No Fear, Spy Optic, and the rest of the industry started leading harder into image, personality, and lifestyle branding. Riders were no longer just wearing race gear. They were becoming marketable personalities. Ricky Carmichael was doing coordinated photo shoots with buzz cuts and playful staging to sell shorts and casual wear. Yamaha ran a full Old West gunslinger campaign for its 1999 YZ lineup, dressing McGrath, John Dowd, and Doug Henry in cowboy gear. The sport wasn't trying to look rough and underground anymore. It wanted attention. Spy Optic built an entire Jeremy McGrath signature goggle series around his celebrity presence.
Intro to the new Showtime goggle. I don't know if you guys can see this, but this thing is...
McGrath's face and name were products in and of themselves. The goggle was secondary. And Oakley, watching all this happen, made a move that left the motocross industry entirely behind. Factory Pilot eye shades in 1984, frog skins in 1985, endorsements from Michael Jordan and Tour de France champion Greg LeMond in the years that followed. By the early 2000s, Oakley was a global fashion company that happened to have motocross roots. They weren't competing for the paddock anymore. They were competing for Hollywood and the mainstream consumer. And they were winning. Their sunglasses ended up replacing Ray-Ban as the eyewear of choice for the character Cyclops in the original X-Men trilogy. Motocross had launched a company that was now dressing superheroes. Scott, watching all this, made a decision that nearly broke them. They chased it. The company poured significant resources into a full motocross apparel line. Pants, jerseys, gloves. They were going to compete with Fox Racing and Thor head-to-head in the gear market. Primo Morato, a legendary national sales manager who left Scott during this period and later returned to help stabilize the company, described the gear market later as a 1 percentile business, a category so volatile, so driven by fast fashion cycles and seasonal aesthetic overhauls, that only companies built around fashion from the ground up could survive in it for long. Scott was an engineering company. It wasn't built around seasonal color palettes and trend cycles. When the gear push failed, competitors were chipping away at the goggle market share Scott had spent 20 years building. Pulling back probably saved the company. Morato came back, the apparel line was abandoned, and the company returned to the philosophy Scott Watanabe had established decades earlier. Goggles and grips. Nothing else. The distraction was over. But the cultural spotlight had moved, and it wouldn't be coming back to Scott in the same way. Surviving the commercial chaos of the late 90s and 2000s required more than a strategic retreat from the wrong market. It required an anchor within professional racing that no amount of image-driven marketing could challenge. And that anchor was Mitch Payton and the Monster Energy Pro Circuit Kawasaki team. The partnership between Scott and Pro Circuit began in 1991 and became one of the longest-running relationships in the history of motorsport. Over 3 decades, the Pro Circuit team accumulated more than 300 victories and 31 championships, every one of them behind Scott lenses. Payton is known in the industry as one of the most demanding team owners the sport has ever produced, obsessively focused on mechanical perfection, uncompromising about what goes on his bikes, and completely indifferent to sponsorship politics when they conflict with performance. Something failed, it was gone, regardless of the contract. His endorsement couldn't be purchased with a marketing budget. It was earned through repeated, unglamorous reliability. Payton said it plainly at one point about the relationship. Throughout a season, you always hear about guys having goggle problems. And with Scott, that's the one thing he doesn't have to worry about. In a decade when every other brand in the space was racing to outspend each other on athlete endorsements and social media presence, Scott had something more durable than any of that. A team that won constantly and never switched. The riders who came through Pro Circuit and wore Scott goggles form a lineage that reads like the sport's Hall of Fame. Jeremy McGrath's early career, Ricky Carmichael, Ryan Villapoto, and a continuous stream of 250 class talent across every era. Scott didn't need to be the loudest name in the paddock. The Pro Circuit bikes made the case every weekend. When Scott eventually released the Prospect Pro Circuit 30-year anniversary goggle, complete with custom anniversary bike builds, it wasn't a marketing invention. It was a genuine celebration of a relationship that neither side had ever walked away from. By 2012, the motocross goggle market had settled into a relatively stable order. Oakley held the premium tier with the Airbrake MX, a technically advanced product retailing between $160 and $220. Built around their Plutonite lens and a rapid lens swap system called Switch Lock, Fox and Spy held the youth-driven lifestyle sector. Scott held the loyalist core racing demographic. It was tense, but predictable. Then a brand called 100% arrived, and almost nothing stayed predictable after that. The 100% logo wasn't new. Drew Lean had created it in 1982 as a badge worn on factory riders' gear to symbolize giving maximum effort. It was a cultural relic, not a company. In 2012, industry veterans Ludo Boinard and Marc Blanchard resurrected it as a fully operational, aggressively marketed optics and apparel brand. Boinard understood the modern action sports economy. The consumer didn't just want functional protective gear anymore. They wanted premium optics that photographed well, looked good off the bike, and generated social media engagement. He positioned 100% directly against the giants and came out swinging. To legitimize the brand overnight, they made the most significant personnel acquisition in the industry in years. They hired Bevo Forti away from Scott. After 31 years as the face of Scott goggles at every major race, Bevo's departure was a shockwave through the paddock. Everyone understood what 100% had actually purchased.
I was going to retire, and Ludo from 100% called me up and says, "Hey, how would you like to come with a goggle company?"
They hadn't just hired an employee. They'd taken one of the most trusted people in motocross away from Scott. Bevo was the man privateers trusted, the man factory teams respected, the man whose loyalty was the stuff of genuine legend. If he believed in 100%, the argument went, then the privateers and the factory teams and the weekend warriors would too. 100% went on to sponsor Cooper Webb and Jet Lawrence, partner with FMF Racing to create FMF Vision, expand into global road cycling with Peter Sagan, and land licensing deals with Major League Baseball in the snow market. They built the Armega goggle and pushed it as hard as a premium product loaded with features and aggressive marketing. They weren't just selling goggles anymore. They were selling the identity that came with them. Oakley, meanwhile, found a second win it hadn't been expecting. Hip-hop artist Travis Scott began wearing Oakley sunglasses, Moto-style harnesses, and custom gear on his global Circus Maximus tour, pulling the brand into a fashion and luxury conversation completely divorced from dirt biking. 40 years after Oakley entered motocross, the brand was still cashing in on the image and identity that world created. Scott's response to all of this was the Prospect goggle, and later the Prospect 2.0, and the response was characteristically unglamorous. No attempt to out-fashion 100%. No attempt to chase the streetwear resurgence Oakley was riding. Scott focused on visibility, durability, comfort, and building a goggle serious racers could trust every weekend. The independent reviews that started stacking up around the three brand shootouts between the Airbrake, the Armega, and the Prospect told the same story repeatedly. The 100% Armega had a heavy, bulky frame. The Oakley Airbrake carried a price point that excluded most amateur riders. The Scott Prospect was the best performance per dollar on the market. Top-tier optical quality and durability at a price most amateur racers could actually afford. Scott hadn't won the hype war, but they'd built the goggle serious racers kept reaching for anyway. There's a version of this story where Scott is a cautionary tale about a brand that lost the culture and never got it back. That reading gets the facts right, but misses what actually happened. Scott didn't really lose the culture just changed around them, and Scott refused to chase every direction it moved in. Walking away from those trends preserved the one thing no competitor could fully replicate, the trust of people who actually raced. Bevo Forti's departure to 100% hurt. There's no neutral way to say that. When the man who turned down factory riders out of loyalty to his privateers leaves after 31 years, it registers. But what his departure also proved is how thoroughly he'd built the brand's reputation before he left. The foundation he laid wasn't dependent on his continued presence to hold. The Pro Circuit partnership held. The core racer loyalty held. The Prospect held. The 89X era goggle, a retro release designed to capitalize on nostalgia for the original 89 No Sweat design, came out in recent years and sold well, which tells you something about the strength of that history. There's enough of a story behind the brand that people want to wear a piece of it, even if it's deliberately backward-looking. Scott isn't the coolest name in motocross right now. That title probably belongs to 100% with their social media machine, their Jet Lawrence association, and their carefully constructed premium image. Oakley owns the fashion crossover space in a way no dirt bike brand can touch. Both of those things are true, and Scott doesn't appear to be losing sleep over either. What Scott is, in 2026, and presumably beyond, is the goggle that sits on the shelf and makes the argument by being exactly what it's always been, the serious racer's choice. The goggle that doesn't fog, the one Mitch Payton never really had to think about. A product built by a guy in Sun Valley, Idaho, who saw riders going blind mid-race and decided to fix it. 56 years later, Scott is still showing up in the winner's circle with a product built around the same idea it started with in 1970, helping riders see through the chaos. Do you think Scott survived because they refused to change too much, or because the rest of motocross changed around them? Thanks for watching, and stay wicked.